If that transfer goes through tonight, your company won't survive the morning. The words sliced through the executive boardroom so cleanly that even the low hum of Manhattan traffic outside the glass walls seemed to disappear. One by one, heads turned toward the back corner of the room where Evelyn Brooks stood beside a stainless steel cleaning cart, one hand still gripping a black trash bag she had been replacing seconds earlier. The massive conference table stretched nearly 30 feet beneath rows of cold white ceiling lights, surrounded by men in tailored suits worth more than Evelyn made in 6 months. At the far end sat Richard Whitmore, billionaire founder of Whitmore Capital, his silver cufflinks glinting as his fingers slowly stopped moving across the merger documents in front of him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The digital stock ticker running silently along the wall continued flashing green numbers while rain streaked against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them. Evelyn felt every eye in the room crawl across her dark blue maintenance uniform, across the latex gloves still covering her hands, across the small embroidered badge over her chest that simply read Evelyn, Facilities. Richard finally leaned back in his leather chair, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he asked quietly, though the danger underneath his voice settled over the room like winter air. Evelyn swallowed once, forcing herself not to look away. "The offshore transfer," she said carefully. "If it clears before midnight, the liability moves to Whitmore Capital." A nervous chuckle escaped from somewhere near the middle of the table. Daniel Cross, Whitmore's sharply dressed CFO, exchanged amused looks with another executive before smirking openly. "Richard," he muttered, "are we seriously doing this?" A few people laughed softly. Not loudly. Just enough to remind Evelyn exactly where she stood. She felt heat rise beneath her skin, but her voice stayed steady. "Account 47B, she continued. "The shell company linked to the transfer was created less than 3 weeks ago. The signatures don't match the original filings." Silence hit harder this time. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not because he believed her. Because he was irritated she was still talking. Outside the storm intensified, rainwater rolling down the windows in silver streams that distorted the city lights below. 47 floors above Midtown, the skyline looked cold enough to crack. Daniel leaned forward, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit. "You read confidential financial documents while cleaning?" he asked. "That's your defense here?" Evelyn opened her mouth, then stopped. Because there was no defense that would matter in this room. Not from someone like her. Richard finally closed the merger folder with slow precision. The soft thud echoed through the boardroom. "What exactly makes you think you understand billion-dollar acquisitions?" he asked. His tone never rose. Somehow that made it worse. Evelyn glanced toward the projection screen where charts and transfer schedules glowed pale blue against the dark walls. "I used to work in auditing," she said quietly. "Before my son got sick." Daniel scoffed openly now. "And now you mop floors in a maintenance uniform," he replied. "Let's not pretend those are the same skill set." More laughter. Someone near the windows shook his head in disbelief. Richard stood slowly from his chair, tall and perfectly composed, the kind of man who looked born inside expensive rooms like this. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "you were hired to empty trash cans, not interrupt executive negotiations." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the cleaning cart. She should stop talking. Every instinct told her to apologize, lower her eyes, disappear back into the hallway before security arrived. But the numbers she had seen kept flashing through her mind like warning sirens. The forged timestamps. The hidden routing accounts. The impossible transfer volume scheduled for 11:47 p.m. She looked directly at Richard Whitmore and spoke one final time. "Then check account 47B before midnight," she said softly. "Because if I'm right, someone inside this room is setting you up to take the fall." Nobody spoke after that. The rain hammered harder against the glass walls while the city below dissolved into blurred rivers of red. Brake lights and silver reflections. Evelyn could hear the faint rattle of the air conditioning above her and the soft ticking of the oversized clock mounted beside the presentation screen. 11:13 p.m. Richard Whitmore stared at her for another long second before turning his attention toward Daniel Cross. "Is there an account 47B connected to this merger?" he asked calmly. Daniel did not hesitate. "There are over 300 routing accounts tied to the acquisition structure," he replied smoothly. "She probably saw partial data and misunderstood it." He smiled politely now, the kind of smile people used when pretending patience with someone they considered beneath them. "Richard, with all due respect, we are wasting time." Several executives nodded in agreement. One woman near the end of the table closed her tablet with visible annoyance. Another checked his watch. Evelyn felt herself shrinking under the weight of the room, but something inside her refused to let go. Because she had seen the transfer schedule with her own eyes. She had seen the duplicate authorization stamps buried inside the disposal bin outside Daniel's office less than an hour earlier. Most people would have ignored them. Most people would have kept walking. But Evelyn had spent too many years staring at numbers not to recognize fear hidden inside paperwork. Richard adjusted the cuff of his dark navy suit and finally looked back at her. "Tell me exactly how a facilities worker suddenly became an expert in forensic accounting," he said. His tone stayed measured, but there was a colder edge underneath now. Evelyn slowly removed her gloves, fingers trembling slightly from the freezing air inside the boardroom. 5 years ago I worked for Grant and Holloway Risk Management in Brooklyn," she answered. "Junior auditor. Mostly corporate compliance reviews." Daniel laughed under his breath. "And now?" Evelyn glanced briefly toward the polished marble floor beneath her worn black shoes. "Now I clean offices at night and take my son to Mount Sinai during the day." Silence returned for half a heartbeat before disappearing beneath the sound of another executive sighing impatiently. Richard walked toward the windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, hands folded behind his back. The city lights reflected faintly across his face, turning him into another sharp shadow inside the storm. "Do you know how many people try to warn me about imaginary conspiracies every year?" he asked quietly without turning around. "Former employees. Investors. Competitors. People online who think they understand finance because they watched documentaries." He finally faced her again. "Fear is not evidence, Ms. Brooks." Evelyn inhaled carefully. "No, sir," she said. "But hidden offshore debt usually is." Daniel's expression tightened for the first time. "Only slightly. Barely noticeable unless someone was looking directly for it." Evelyn noticed anyway. Richard did not. "That is enough," Daniel snapped suddenly. "This conversation is absurd." He pressed a button beneath the table. Somewhere beyond the boardroom doors, footsteps immediately started moving across the hallway carpet. Security. Evelyn felt her stomach sink, but she kept her posture straight. The doors opened seconds later and 2 security guards stepped inside wearing dark gray uniforms. Richard remained perfectly still. "Escort Ms. Brooks out," Daniel ordered. One of the guards approached carefully, almost apologetic. Evelyn nodded once before they could even speak. She understood how buildings like this worked. People like her were allowed inside only as long as they stayed invisible. She reached for the handle of her cleaning cart, but before turning away, she looked once more at Richard Whitmore. The billionaire still stood beside the windows with the Manhattan skyline glowing behind him like a kingdom built from cold blue fire. "You still have 36 minutes before the transfer clears," Evelyn said softly. "After that, none of this will belong to you anymore." The elevator doors closed with a muted chime, sealing Evelyn inside a box of brushed steel and pale fluorescent light. For a moment she just stood there gripping the handle of her cleaning cart while the numbers above the door slowly descended from 47 to 46 to 45. Her pulse still hammered against her ribs. She could Smell industrial cleaner on her sleeves mixed with the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering from the executive floor. Somewhere above her, billion-dollar conversations continued beneath crystal lights and polished marble while she rode downward toward the service corridors nobody important ever saw. The elevator stopped briefly on floor 32. Two young analysts stepped inside carrying laptops and takeaway coffees. Neither looked directly at Evelyn. One of them adjusted his tie while scrolling through market projections on his phone. Tokyo opens in less than 2 hours, he muttered quietly to the other. Whitmore is going to dominate Asia after this acquisition. The second man nodded without even glancing up. Richard Whitmore always wins. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the scratched rubber floor mat beneath her shoes. That was the thing about powerful men. People repeated their success so often it started sounding permanent. Like gravity. Like weather. Like something beyond question. The elevator continued downward. By the time she reached the basement service level, the warmth and shine of the executive tower had disappeared completely. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead. Pipes rattled behind concrete walls. The air smelled like detergent, wet cardboard, and old coffee grounds. Evelyn pushed her cart slowly through the corridor toward the employee locker room, her mind still trapped upstairs inside account 47B. She knew she should let it go. She had done more than enough already. More than most people would risk. But every instinct she had sharpened during her years in auditing kept whispering the same thing. The timing was wrong. The numbers were too clean. Fraud always tried too hard to look perfect. Inside the locker room, the old vending machine hummed beside a flickering television mounted high in the corner. A weather reporter stood in front of Lower Manhattan beneath sheets of rain while stock updates crawled silently across the bottom of the screen. Evelyn opened her dented gray locker and carefully placed her gloves inside. A small photo taped to the metal door caught her attention immediately. Marcus. 9 years old. Thin smile. Hospital bracelet barely visible beneath the sleeve of his sweater. The picture had been taken 3 months earlier after one of his treatments at Mount Sinai. Evelyn touched the corner of the photo gently before closing her eyes for a second. That was why she worked nights. Why she took every extra shift she could. Medication bills did not care about pride. The locker room door swung open behind her. You are either very brave or very crazy. Evelyn turned to see Luis from maintenance carrying a toolbox under one arm. He shook rainwater from his jacket and stared at her with wide eyes. Word travels fast upstairs, he said quietly. People are talking. Evelyn forced a tired smile. That usually means trouble. Luis lowered his voice. Daniel Cross just walked through legal about 10 minutes ago screaming into his phone. That made her stomach tighten. Screaming about what? No idea, Luis replied. But security is all over the executive floor now. Somewhere deep inside the building, a muffled alarm suddenly echoed through the ventilation system. Not loud. Not urgent. Just one sharp electronic tone followed by silence. Luis frowned toward the ceiling. That is strange. Evelyn slowly turned toward the television mounted near the ceiling. The financial ticker crawling across the bottom of the screen had changed from green to yellow. Then red. Whitmore Capital stock futures were suddenly dropping. Fast. The red numbers kept falling. Evelyn stared at the television screen as the financial ticker refreshed again and again beneath the weather report, each update worse than the last. Whitmore Capital futures down 6%. Then 9. Then 11. Luis slowly lowered the wrench in his hand. That cannot be good, he muttered. The locker room suddenly felt colder than before. Evelyn stepped closer to the television mounted near the ceiling while rain continued rattling faintly through the underground pipes above them. On screen, reporters had started speaking faster now, their polished calm beginning to crack beneath the urgency flooding Wall Street. analysts were calling it an unexpected overnight correction tied to leaked concerns surrounding an international acquisition deal. Evelyn's chest tightened. Leaked concerns. Someone knew. Somewhere above them, elevators began moving rapidly between floors. The distant sound echoed through the service corridors like metal lungs breathing too fast. Then came footsteps. Sharp. Quick. More than one person. Luis looked toward the hallway just as two junior legal assistants hurried past the open locker room door carrying folders against their chests. One of them was nearly jogging. Conference room now, the other whispered. Richard is losing his mind upstairs. Evelyn looked back at the screen. The yellow ticker turned fully red. Another alert appeared. Investors demand review of offshore holdings. Her stomach sank lower. Account 47B. She knew it. She had known it the second she saw the duplicate signatures buried in the discarded files. Fraud always moved fast right before collapse. Like a building cracking from the inside long before anyone heard the noise. Upstairs on the executive floor, Richard Whitmore stood frozen beside the conference table while legal teams crowded around glowing monitors. The atmosphere inside the room had changed completely in less than 20 minutes. Gone were the relaxed smiles and expensive confidence from earlier. Now phones rang non-stop. Screens flashed warnings. Half-finished glasses of sparkling water sat untouched beside stacks of merger documents. Daniel Cross paced near the windows with one hand pressed tightly against his phone. That information was sealed, he hissed under his breath. Nobody outside the transaction team was supposed to see those transfers. Richard slowly turned toward him. What exactly was leaked? Daniel stopped moving for half a second. Too long. Richard noticed immediately. The billionaire's eyes narrowed as another executive hurried toward him carrying a tablet. Sir, the man said carefully, Asian markets are reacting to the offshore routing disclosures. Richard grabbed the tablet. The graphs on the screen looked like a cliff collapsing into darkness. Hundreds of millions disappearing by the minute. His jaw tightened. Pull up account 47B, he ordered. Silence. Nobody moved. At first. Daniel forced a laugh that sounded thin now, brittle around the edges. Richard, this is panic trading. We should focus on controlling the narrative before opening random internal accounts because of something a janitor said. Richard looked up slowly. Open the account. This time his voice carried enough force to cut through the room instantly. An analyst seated near the projection screen swallowed hard before typing rapidly across the keyboard. Numbers filled the monitor. Routing chains. Offshore entities. Wire transfers. Then the room went still again. Completely still. Richard stepped closer to the screen while cold white light reflected across his face. One transfer after another had been rerouted through shell corporations registered less than a month earlier. The authorization signatures did not match. The timestamps overlapped. And sitting at the center of all of it was Whitmore Capital. Legally exposed. Financially responsible. Daniel's face drained of color. Richard, he began carefully, I can explain. But Richard was no longer listening. Because for the first time that night, the billionaire finally realized the woman in the maintenance uniform had been telling the truth. The boardroom no longer sounded like a room full of billionaires. It sounded like panic. Phones vibrated non-stop across the polished conference table while overlapping voices filled the air in sharp nervous bursts. One attorney was already speaking with federal regulators. Another was trying to stop financial reporters from publishing leaked routing documents that had somehow started spreading online. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan glowed beneath sheets of rain and distant ambulance lights, but inside Whitmore Capital, the atmosphere had turned thin and suffocating. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the projection screen without speaking. The numbers reflected across his face in cold white flashes as analysts continued digging deeper into account 47B. More shell companies appeared every minute. More hidden transfers. More forged authorizations. Every trail led back toward Whitmore Capital like wires feeding into a detonator. Daniel Cross loosened his tie with trembling fingers. "Richard, listen to me," he said carefully. "This can still be contained." Richard finally looked at him. "Contained?" His voice stayed low, almost calm, but the room fell silent instantly. "You routed fraudulent liabilities through my company." Daniel swallowed hard. "Temporary routing structures are standard during acquisitions. Do not insult me by pretending this is standard." Richard stepped closer now, and for the first time all night, something heavier than anger moved beneath his expression. Humiliation. The realization that everyone else in the room had watched a woman in a cleaning uniform warn him while he dismissed her like background noise. One of the analysts suddenly looked up from his screen. "Sir," he said nervously, "there is more." Richard turned sharply. "What?" The young analyst hesitated before rotating the monitor toward the room. "Somebody initiated a secondary transfer sequence 15 minutes ago." Daniel froze. Tiny movement. Barely visible. But Richard saw it immediately. "How much?" Richard asked. The analyst inhaled carefully. $380 million. The room erupted again. Executives started speaking all at once. Someone cursed under their breath. Another legal advisor nearly knocked over a chair trying to grab his phone. Richard did not move. His eyes stayed locked on Daniel Cross. "You were planning to disappear before the market opened," he said quietly. Daniel lifted both hands defensively. "Richard, you are emotional right now. Answer the question." Daniel's polished confidence finally cracked. Sweat glistened along his forehead beneath the sterile conference lights. The acquisition was collapsing already, he snapped suddenly. "You needed someone to absorb the losses." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "So you chose me." "You were too arrogant to notice," Daniel fired back. "That woman downstairs saw it faster than you did." Silence slammed into the room again. Richard's jaw tightened so hard a muscle flickered near his temple. Not because Daniel was wrong. Because he was right. Down in the basement locker room, Evelyn sat alone beside the vending machine with a paper cup of stale coffee warming her hands. The television continued flashing breaking updates while storm water rattled through the old pipes overhead. Whitmore Capital shares were collapsing internationally now. Financial anchors spoke with controlled urgency, repeating phrases like fraud exposure, offshore irregularities, and emergency review. Evelyn stared quietly at the screen while Marcus's hospital text reminder glowed softly on her phone beside her coffee cup. Cardiology appointment. 8:30 a.m. She closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere 47 floors above her, powerful people were fighting to save fortunes large enough to buy entire neighborhoods. Meanwhile, all she could think about was whether her son would be strong enough for another treatment next month. The locker room door suddenly burst open. Luis stepped inside breathing hard. "Evelyn," he said. "Richard Whitmore is looking for you." Evelyn did not answer right away. She just sat there holding the paper cup between both hands while the vending machine hummed softly beside her. The coffee had already gone cold. Across the locker room, the television continued flashing red banners and emergency market updates beneath the storm coverage rolling across New York City. Rainwater tapped steadily against the narrow basement windows near the ceiling. Somewhere above them, elevators rushed non-stop through the tower carrying lawyers, executives, and assistants into the kind of chaos expensive buildings tried so hard to hide. Luis shifted nervously near the doorway. "Evelyn," he repeated more quietly this time. "I think this is serious." She looked down at her phone again. Marcus's appointment reminder still glowed on the cracked screen. 8:30 a.m. Pediatric cardiology. She rubbed her thumb slowly across the edge of the phone case before slipping it back into her pocket. "Everything up there is always serious," she said softly. Louise frowned. "Not like this." Evelyn finally stood, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. Her maintenance badge swung lightly against her uniform as she pushed the cleaning cart toward the corner wall. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting pale reflections across the damp concrete floor. For a second she caught her own reflection in the dark television screen. Tired eyes. Worn shoes. A woman people looked through every single day. It almost made her laugh. 47 floors above her, billionaires were now tearing apart financial records because they had finally listened to the cleaner they mocked less than an hour earlier. The irony sat heavy in her chest. Luis lowered his voice again. "You were right." Evelyn looked toward him quietly. "That does not feel as good as people think it does." The locker room fell silent after that. Only the rain kept talking. She reached into her locker and pulled out her dark gray coat, the fabric still damp from earlier that evening. The small photograph of Marcus remained taped inside the metal door. In the picture he was smiling despite the hospital bracelet around his wrist, one front tooth missing, his thin arms wrapped around a stuffed dinosaur nearly as big as his chest. Evelyn stared at the photo for a long moment before closing the locker carefully. Gentle. Like she was protecting something fragile. Upstairs, Richard Whitmore stood alone inside his private office while the city glowed cold beyond the glass walls. The massive room looked different now. Smaller somehow. The skyline that usually made him feel powerful now felt distant and sharp, like broken glass scattered across the dark. His reflection hovered faintly against the window beside the blinking lights of Midtown Manhattan. Behind him, muted voices moved through the executive floor as legal teams scrambled to stop the damage spreading through international markets. Richard loosened his tie slowly and looked down at the printed transfer records spread across his desk. Every signature. Every shell account. Every hidden liability. The evidence had been sitting inside his own company while he dismissed the only person honest enough to warn him. He could still hear Daniel's words repeating in his head. "That woman downstairs saw it faster than you did." Richard closed his eyes briefly. In 30 years of building Whitmore Capital, nobody had ever spoken to him the way Evelyn Brooks had. No fear. No performance. No attempt to impress him. Just the truth. Raw and inconvenient. His office phone rang again. He ignored it. Another line started ringing seconds later. Then another. He ignored those too. Because for the first time in years, Richard Whitmore was no longer thinking about investors or stock prices or television headlines. He was thinking about the look in Evelyn's eyes when security escorted her out of the boardroom. Not angry. Not vindictive. Just disappointed. And somehow that felt worse. By 2:15 in the morning, Whitmore Capital no longer felt like the untouchable empire it had been only hours earlier. Television vans lined the street outside the tower. Rain-soaked reporters clustered beneath umbrellas while cameras pointed toward the glowing lobby windows. Inside, the atmosphere had turned frantic. Lawyers rushed between conference rooms carrying stacks of printed documents. Junior analysts sat pale-faced behind rows of monitors refreshing market losses every few seconds. Security guards whispered into radios near the elevators. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody even pretended things were under control. Richard Whitmore walked through the executive floor slowly, almost mechanically, while employees lowered their eyes as he passed. The marble beneath his shoes reflected cold silver light from the emergency financial broadcasts playing across mounted screens. Every channel carried the same story now. Offshore fraud exposure. Suspicious transfer chains. Regulatory investigation expected by morning. One headline hit harder than the others. Whitmore Capital failed internal oversight review. Richard stopped walking when he saw it. Failed oversight. 30 years building one of the most respected financial firms in America reduced to a single sentence beneath a breaking news banner. His jaw tightened. Nearby, two young associates immediately fell silent when they noticed him standing there. One of them quickly looked away, pretending to focus on her tablet. Richard understood that look. Fear mixed with disappointment. Respect evaporating in real time. He continued toward the boardroom where legal teams were still working through the night. The massive glass doors stood open, now exposing the damage inside. Coffee cups everywhere. Jackets draped over chairs. Half the executives who had laughed at Evelyn earlier were now speaking in hushed, nervous voices while federal compliance officers reviewed transfer records through remote video calls projected onto the main screen. Daniel Cross was gone. Nobody knew exactly when he had left the building. Richard stared at the empty chair near the windows where his chief financial officer had been sitting only an hour ago. Betrayal settled heavily inside his chest, but another feeling sat underneath it now. Shame. Because none of this would have happened if he had listened. His assistant hurried toward him holding a tablet. "Sir, federal investigators want immediate access to all internal communication records tied to the acquisition." Richard nodded once. "Give them everything." The assistant blinked in surprise. "Everything?" Richard looked around the shattered remains of his perfect executive floor. "I am done protecting appearances." The assistant walked away quickly. Richard remained standing near the conference table while rain continued sliding down the windows behind him in long silver lines. Then his eyes drifted toward the maintenance hallway across the floor. Empty now. Quiet. He could still picture Evelyn standing there earlier with her cleaning cart and damp gloves, trying to warn people who only saw her uniform. Richard slowly sat down in the same leather chair where he had dismissed her. For the first time in years, the room felt unbearably large. He thought about the way she had spoken about her son. Not dramatic. Not asking for sympathy. Just honest. While everyone else in the room fought to protect wealth, she had been carrying an entirely different kind of pressure. Hospital bills. Night shifts. Exhaustion. Real life. Richard rubbed one hand slowly across his face before looking toward the dark windows again. Somewhere out there in the storm, Evelyn Brooks was probably heading home on a late subway train while his empire collapsed across international markets. And somehow she had handled the night with more dignity than every executive on this floor combined. His phone buzzed. Again beside the merger documents. Another investor calling. Another crisis. Richard silenced it without checking the screen. Then quietly, almost to himself, he spoke the words he should have said hours ago. "She tried to save us." The rain had finally slowed by the time Evelyn stepped out of the downtown subway station just after 3 in the morning. The city looked washed out beneath the streetlights, all silver reflections and empty sidewalks glistening under the fading storm. Her body ached with exhaustion as she pulled her coat tighter and crossed the street toward Mount Sinai Hospital. Even at that hour, the emergency entrance glowed brightly against the darkness, automatic doors sliding open and shut while tired nurses moved through the lobby carrying clipboards and paper cups of coffee. Evelyn walked quietly through the hallways she knew too well. The smell of antiseptic and stale air settled around her instantly. Monitors beeped softly behind half-closed doors while fluorescent lights cast pale reflections across the polished floors. On the pediatric cardiology wing, everything felt slower. Softer somehow. More human than the cold panic still consuming Whitmore Capital uptown. Marcus was asleep when she entered the room. His small frame curled beneath a thin blue hospital blanket, one hand resting beside the stuffed green dinosaur he carried everywhere. The heart monitor beside his bed blinked steadily in the dim light. Evelyn stood there for a moment just watching him breathe. Slow. Even. Safe. The tension she had carried all night loosened slightly inside her chest. She sat carefully beside the bed and brushed her fingers gently across his forehead. "Hey, baby," she whispered, though he did not wake. Outside the narrow hospital window, the first faint signs of dawn began bleeding into the sky over Manhattan. Gray light touched the tops of distant buildings while the city slowly crawled toward another morning. Evelyn leaned back in the chair beside Marcus's bed, closing her tired eyes for only a second. A soft knock interrupted the silence. She looked up expecting a nurse. Instead, Richard Whitmore stood in the doorway. He looked nothing like the man from the boardroom. His expensive suit jacket was gone. His tie hung loose around his collar. Dark circles shadowed his eyes beneath the harsh hospital lighting. For a moment neither of them spoke. The billionaire who once commanded entire rooms now stood awkwardly beside a pediatric hospital door holding 2 paper coffee cups like he did not know what else to bring. Evelyn straightened slowly in her chair. "How did you find me?" she asked quietly. Richard glanced toward Marcus sleeping in the bed before answering. "Your employee records listed Mount Sinai as your emergency contact location." Evelyn looked at him for another long second, then back toward her son. Richard stepped inside carefully, almost cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the stillness of the room. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm between them. "I should have listened to you," he said finally. "No arrogance. No corporate polish. Just exhaustion and truth." Evelyn studied his face quietly. Somewhere beneath the billionaire image she recognized something unfamiliar now. Humility. Richard handed her one of the coffee cups. "Black coffee," he said softly. "I remembered that from the break room downstairs." Evelyn accepted it slowly, surprised despite herself. The paper cup felt warm against her cold hands. Richard looked toward Marcus again. "How old is he?" 9. "Heart condition?" Evelyn nodded once. "Since birth." Richard swallowed hard and lowered his eyes briefly. "And you still came to work every night carrying all of that?" Evelyn gave a tired smile that barely lasted a second. "People do what they have to do." Silence settled gently across the room after that. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Somewhere down the hallway a nurse laughed softly at something another doctor said. Morning light continued spreading slowly across the city outside. Richard looked at Marcus sleeping peacefully beneath the blanket, then back at Evelyn. "I spent 30 years building a company," he said quietly. "But tonight the only person who actually protected it was the woman emptying the trash bins." Evelyn looked down at the coffee in her hands. "I was not trying to protect the company," she replied softly. "I was trying to protect the people who would suffer when it collapsed." Richard stared at her after that without speaking. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone had reminded him there was a difference. 3 weeks later, the city looked different under the morning sun. The storm that had swallowed Manhattan that night was long gone, replaced now by crisp autumn air and pale gold light reflecting across rows of glass towers downtown. Newsstands near Lexington Avenue still carried headlines about the Whitmore Capital collapse. Financial analysts continued debating how one of the most powerful firms on Wall Street had nearly destroyed itself from the inside. Daniel Cross had disappeared before federal investigators reached him. Several executives resigned quietly within days. Investors sued. Regulators circled. And for the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore was no longer treated like a man too powerful to fail. But somehow, the world had kept moving. Subways still rattled beneath the streets. Coffee carts still released clouds of steam into the cold air each morning. Nurses still hurried through hospital hallways carrying charts and tired smiles. Life had not stopped for anyone. Especially not for Evelyn Brooks. She stepped out of the subway station wearing a charcoal coat and carrying a worn leather folder against her chest. The morning breeze lifted loose strands of hair beside her face as she crossed the street toward a smaller office building several blocks away from the financial district. Nothing about the building screamed power. No marble columns. No giant corporate logos. Just clean glass windows catching sunlight above a modest brass sign near the entrance. Brooks Risk Analytics. Evelyn paused for half a second when she saw the name. Not because she still could not believe it. Because part of her still remembered the woman pushing a cleaning cart through service hallways only weeks earlier. Inside the lobby, the scent of fresh paint and brewed coffee filled the air. A young receptionist looked up immediately and smiled. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks." Evelyn smiled back softly before continuing toward the elevator. As the doors opened, she noticed someone standing near the windows overlooking the street below. Richard Whitmore. He wore a simple dark coat now instead of the perfectly tailored power suits that once seemed stitched into his identity. No security team surrounded him. No executives hovered nearby waiting for instructions. Just a man standing quietly with both hands in his pockets while morning traffic crawled beneath the city lights outside. Evelyn slowed slightly when she saw him. Richard turned toward her and offered a small nod. "I heard Marcus's treatment went well," he said. Evelyn's expression softened instantly. It did. Richard looked relieved in a way that felt completely genuine. Good. Silence settled gently between them after that. Comfortable this time. Through the lobby windows, sunlight stretched across the polished floor in long golden lines. Somewhere deeper inside the office, phones rang softly while keyboards clicked in steady rhythms. Real work. Honest work. Evelyn looked toward the brass sign near the elevators again before speaking. "You really did not have to fund this place." Richard shook his head slowly. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did." Evelyn studied him carefully. The old arrogance was gone now. In its place stood something quieter. Something human. Richard glanced around the small office before speaking again. "You know," he said, "for years I thought strength meant being the smartest person in the room." He looked back at her. "Turns out it means being willing to hear the truth from people the world ignores." Evelyn said nothing. She did not need to. Because some lessons sounded louder in silence. Behind them, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Employees stepped around them carrying coffee cups and folders while the city continued waking outside the glass. Richard moved aside first, giving Evelyn space to walk forward. And as she stepped past him into the sunlight spilling across the lobby floor, nobody saw a cleaner anymore. They saw the woman who had stood alone inside a room full of powerful people and chosen honesty anyway.